Alright folks, this time I want to get into a little bit about code and document inspections. So the idea of sitting down and formally or informally going through something looking for potential problems, right? Just reading it and looking for possible issues as a way of trying to improve the quality of it. So this is where I want to go, and we'll talk about some of the different options. Most teams have some kind of a mechanism in place for going through and checking each other's code and checking each other's documents to make sure that they're correct, that they're reasonably high quality, and that they follow whatever standards the team has in place. This might be really informal. It might be just a case where, we've got this rule of thumb that when you think that you've got something done, just get somebody else to look it over, read it over, and give us some feedback just to make sure that we haven't missed something. Right? So it might be fairly casual. At the other end of the spectrum, it might be extremely formal, where for every item, before it actually gets approved and rolled out and used for real, if you like, then it has to undergo a formal inspection process with a team of people assigned specific duties, specific roles to go through and review it, and they have to give an assessment of it, and until it meets that assessment, you can't use it. Right? So there might be a highly formal process. These kinds of things might be carried out synchronously, where you all get together, whether it's online or whether it's physically together, where you all get together and go through it as a group all at once. Or it might be asynchronously, where we assign the people that are going to do the inspection, and over the course of a week or so, each of you goes through it on your own, and you communicate, through whatever your favorite mechanism is. Just sharing ideas and sharing thoughts and discussing things online until you come up with some kind of an agreement on what the final results are. So there's lots of different ways that this could take place. Once upon a time, most things were done kind of synchronously, face-to-face, either physically face-to-face or online in a meeting, but more and more the process is trending towards an asynchronous approach. And the same idea as if you've got a Google document or something like that, where you're all working on it and communicating about it and eventually reaching some kind of consensus on what the content should be. Now, pretty much anything can be inspected. Right? We tend to think of code inspections, but any kind of documentation, any kind of process. Right? You might go through and inspect the plan for testing something, or to go through and inspect the actual data files you're using for testing, or to go through and inspect your standards document to make sure that your standards document actually is laid out the way that you want and is readable and is easy to follow and is actually correct and that kind of thing. Anything can get inspected. It does take time and resources to do this. If you're going to have whether it's just one person go through your code or your document or your whatever it is, right? They are spending that time to go through it. If you're actually having a group of people get together to formally inspect it, then you've got an entire team spending their time going through and reviewing each item that each person does. So you might very well prioritize which items get a full inspection and which ones get a kind of less formal peer review. So there might be some things you regard as critical that are going to get inspected in detail and formally, and others where you say, okay, these things will just, do get somebody else to look it over, but it's a much less formal process, a much less time-consuming process. Now, one of the things that you have to decide on if you are going to inspect something is how much can a group reasonably inspect in one session, or one go-round, or 1 week, or whatever your time frame is going to be. You can't say, here's a 10,000 line program, everybody go through it by Friday. You have to come up with some kind of a reasonable breakdown. Typically, you're going to find that we aim for a couple of hours of inspection time per person per whatever the item is. So you want to pick a chunk of code that one person can reasonably go through in a couple of hours, or a document or a piece of a document that one person can go through in a couple of hours with a reasonable chance of identifying things that are potentially wrong with it. right? So a chance for one person to go through it in a couple of hours in reasonable detail. And that's going to depend, if you've got a really complex chunk of code, that might just be 20 or 30 lines of code. On the other hand, if it's something that's got a lot of relatively straightforward interface material and things, it might be a much bigger chunk of code, or again, a much bigger chunk of documentation. Now, deciding when something should be inspected is a matter of some argument. It can be a little tricky to figure out the ideal time to inspect something. The earlier you get other people to look at your code, the better the chance is that at least one of them is going to spot something that's going to save you a lot of time later on, because they're going to point out something that, you've got this bug here, and it's something you would not have thought of. On the other hand, if you get people to inspect things fairly early, then your code is still in a fairly rough state, or your document is still in a fairly rough state, and there are lots of defects that everybody's going to find, and you're kind of wasting their time finding a lot of things that you obviously would have found anyways really quickly. So you're looking for that kind of sweet spot where most of the stuff that, well, I guess any of the things that you're going to catch, obviously, you've caught. And what's left are the things that you might not catch for a long time. So you're looking for the ideal balance as to when to get people to inspect things. So you might have a bunch of sort of rules of thumb as to what must be done before you can ask people to inspect your code. Maybe it's got to compile cleanly, it's got to be in some standardized format, it's got to have run through this tool and that tool and this tool and pass those. So you might have a variety of rules saying, okay, once it's gone through these hoops, then you can request an inspection. In terms of getting together a team of people to inspect, so this is going beyond the just sort of having one other person casually look at it, the idea is if we're going to go for a formal inspection, it's pretty common to have, say, 3 to 5 people involved. Each one of them is going to get assigned a role or multiple roles during the inspection process, and they'll each go through the document kind of from the perspective of their role. So the author's the obvious one, that's whoever actually wrote the item that's being inspected, right? They're going to be there to kind of explain anything that the other inspectors are confused about. Usually you'll have somebody acting as a moderator, somebody that's just kind of in charge of the inspection process to kind of keep it coordinated and organized, keep it on time, keep it on track, make sure people don't get sidetracked, talking about whatever might be going on. So making sure that the processes are being followed, keeping the discussions on topic, and probably also trying to keep it professional, because people can have fairly strong opinions about what's the right and wrong way to do things, and you can have sometimes an inspector getting a little aggressive over what's wrong with something, and an author getting a little defensive or aggressive about how great their stuff is. The moderator's also there to kind of keep that smooth, right? Make sure that things don't get too personal or too heated. Disagreement is fine, discussion is fine, arguments are actually okay in a lot of situations, but you do want to make sure you're keeping it professional and not personal. A common role is just the reader, somebody who is actually going to go through and say, okay, right now we're looking at line 37, and they're just going through. This is more for the kind of synchronous approach, where they're saying, okay, now let's go through and look at lines 37 through 39. And if you're sitting in a group, they might actually read them out to make sure everybody's clear on what we're actually talking about, just keeping track of where we are so far. And then a scribe or a writer is the person who's actually writing down the decisions that the group actually makes. So keeping a formal record of the decisions that have been made, and maybe some of the discussions if there are relevant points that we want to kind of archive for later. Again, you might have combinations of these things, so you might have somebody acting as the reader and the scribe, or as the moderator and the reader and the scribe. And then you've got the inspectors, who are the folks who are actually looking for things that are potentially wrong with the item under inspection. Now, usually your inspectors will have specific areas that they're focused on. So you might have an inspector that's focused on, I don't know, variable initialization and whatnot. You might have another inspector that's focused on making sure that standards are being followed. You might have another inspector that's focused on, how testable is the code that you're producing. Another one that's focused on how maintainable is the code that you're inspecting. And again, a single inspector can have multiple of those perspectives that they're in charge of. So, again, having everybody look for everything often winds up with a whole bunch of people focused on one aspect of it and nobody looking at another aspect. So this is the notion behind trying to assign roles or perspectives to people. You might assign perspectives like, well, look at this from the point of view of a new user. Look at this from the point of view of a power user. Look at this from the point of view as a tester, as somebody that's working on the support staff, as a maintainer, as the paying client. Right? So you can give inspectors different perspectives to try and use when they're going through this, so that people are catching things that they might not have if they were just looking at it from the point of view of a developer. Again, sometimes the focus is more technical, where you'll have some inspectors focused on looking for specific code aspects that they're interested in, or specific documentation aspects that they're interested in. Now, you typically want a decent mix of people on the team doing the inspection. Right? You want a kind of a broad base so that you can catch things from as many different angles as possible. Right? You're probably going to want somebody else from your own team there during the inspection, because they've got they're really familiar with whatever it is you're working on, right? They've got a good understanding of the material itself. You probably also want somebody from outside the team just to have a kind of fresh perspective, an independent view, where they're not stuck in whatever the mindset is for your team, right? As your team has been going through developing things, they've typically developed some blind spots and just a kind of static way of looking at things. Because you've been going through this together and talking it through so many times, you wind up with at least some common ideas on how you want to approach things. It's handy to have somebody who doesn't have that kind of static approach, where somebody's an outsider. And again, you probably want somebody with a completely different perspective, somebody who's actually not there from a fully developer point of view, but somebody who's there from testing or there from support. So again, they've got a completely different viewpoint. Again, I mentioned the idea that your inspections can either be synchronous, where we actually have everybody together at the same time, either virtually or physically, and then we've got the case where people are doing things asynchronously. We'll talk about that one in a sec. So, synchronous inspections, usually the idea that you've got a group meeting where we're actually going through and reading a line of the document or of the code and talking about it. Reading a line and talking about it. Reading a line and talking about it. To do that, you don't want people to kind of look at the thing for the first time in the meeting. You want people to have read through the item ahead of time. You want to make sure that they know their role, they know what this thing is supposed to be doing, what it's supposed to be about, so they're well prepared, they've gone through it, they've made their own notes on what they think the possible problems are, and then you all meet together and compare notes, right? You go through this line by line and compare the problems that you found, discuss the problems that you found, talk them through with the author, talk them through with each other, decide if things really are problems or not. Right? You've got the opportunity to prepare for it and then talk about it effectively, efficiently. So that means you've got to give everybody enough time before that meeting to get ready for it. So you've got to, usually the moderator is going to be responsible for this, right? Finding a date and time that works for everybody, making sure that everybody gets all of the material ahead of time, badgering them a little bit to make sure that they've actually all done it ahead of time, they've gone through the notes and the material on their own. And then during the meeting itself, you're going to go through line by line. Here's the next line in the item. Pause for a moment. Does anybody have an issue with this? If there's a potential issue, you discuss it, and then you write down whatever your decision is at the end. And then once you've gone through everything, you'll kind of write up a summary make sure that everybody gets a copy of the notes that you've got from the inspection, give everybody a chance to add anything that they thought of after the inspection was over. You know how often an hour or two after something ends, you go, oh, I should have talked about this as well. I forgot about this, or I forgot about that. It gives people the chance to correct anything, to add anything, to add a little bit of further discussion before you move on with things. Now, if you're doing it asynchronously, again, this is the idea of communicating through email or chat or shared documents or whatever it might be, but you're going through the same idea. It's just not everybody's actually doing it at the exact same instant, right? You're all still going back to whatever the communication channel is, checking on it, looking at people's feedback, discussing it, saying, oh yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. It does tend to mean that you're probably not going to go through things in as static an order, because people are going to be at different points in their inspection when they point out, oh, gee, I think I found a problem here. But you still want to have somebody acting in that kind of reader role to make sure that we've actually talked about every piece of the system, every piece of the item under inspection, to make sure it all did get covered. And again, you've still got this notion that, once we think we've got everything covered, we want to summarize it and give everybody one last chance for corrections or additions or more feedback. Now, there can be a bunch of possible outcomes from an inspection like this. Right? It could be that we go through and everything's perfect and we go, oh, wonderful, it's all done. That's not all that common. Usually you're going to find a couple of little things wrong with something where it's a more or less a trivial fix, right? The author can just go through and fix them and then just check in with the moderator afterwards to say, yo, here, I did it. I didn't forget about it. I did do this. All right, so you've got a nice simple fix where you don't have to get everybody back involved, but you've got the moderator there to just double check that this was dealt with. You might have some more complex fixes involved where you want the author to check in with not just the moderator, but maybe also some of the people who had concerns and confirm with them that the way they've fixed it is suitable, that it addresses whatever the problem was. It might be worse than that. You might have discovered some really serious issues where you think that, what, there's this big overhaul that needs to be done, and then I think we should come back and inspect it again. So it might be a matter of sort of back to the drawing board, and then we'll redo this. And there might be other side issues where nobody's really certain if it's a problem or not. So this essentially gets dumped on the author as homework, if you like, where they have to go off and investigate the issue, figure out if it is a problem or not, and then come back to either a part of the committee or the entire inspection team and say, okay, look, here's what I came up with. Either it turns out that this doesn't really look like it's a problem, and explain why and see if the team approves, or I do think it's a problem and here's what we need to do next. So there can be other sort of asides that you wind up dealing with. One of the things that I wanted to get into here, and I mentioned this briefly early on, is to try and keep this professional, not personal. The idea is to find problems here so that they don't make it out, further into the process, so that it doesn't get into the testing stage or into the client stage before we actually identify and deal with these problems, right? It's meant to help improve the quality of the product. Finding defects is better than not finding them. It's not meant as a personal criticism of the author, and the inspection team should take care to not express it as a criticism of the author. Don't start your identification of a problem with, you idiot, why did you do this? Right? You're trying to keep this professional. So the inspectors should be professional, not make it personal, and the author should do their best to treat it professionally. It's not criticism of them personally, it's an identification of a possible issue to address. Right? And the moderator is hopefully somebody that's adept at helping to keep the tone professional, to bring people back in line and maybe pull them aside and talk to them if you need to say, look, you're making this personal. That's really not what this is all about. So that is something that I want you to keep in mind as you're going through this. And once you get out of this place and have to start dealing with real people or real team situations. Well, actually, for that matter, come your courses like 310 and 375 and whatnot, where you're working with teams of other students, it is going to become important to try and keep it professional there, not personal. Okay, I will leave that there.